When the Wright brothers were growing up in Dayton, Ohio, they used to go sledding every winter. And they noticed that the sleds on the hill, some would go fast and some would go slow. They wanted to have the fastest sled on the hill. So they went home and they asked their mother. They said, "Can you help us build the fastest sled on that hill?" And she said, "Yeah, I'll help you." And the boys started walking towards the garage at their house where they would build the sled. And their mother said, "No, don't go to the garage. Before we can build the sled, we first have to design it." And she said, "The place to design it is here on the kitchen table." And so those young boys learned from their mother the process of design. And she asked them questions. She said, "What would make a sled go faster if it had long runners or short runners?" And she engaged them in a dialogue of question and answer, which helped them realize that they needed long runners with the least amount of friction to have the fastest sled on the hill. So with the help of their mother, Orville and Wilbur Wright designed and built the fastest sled on the hill. And they flew down that hill. And that was when they were probably 10 or 12 years old. Fast forward a few years to 1892. Orville and Wilbur Wright have both graduated high school. Neither of them have gone to college, and they need to choose some kind of career for themselves. The automobile had been invented already, but it was a plaything for the rich. It was still 16 more years before the Model T was going to be invented by Ford in 1908. So this is back in 1892. The big deal back then was bicycles. Everybody loved to have a bicycle. It was fairly inexpensive. It was a form of transportation and a form of recreation. So the Wright brothers opened up a bicycle store in Dayton, Ohio. And the store was successful. But Wilbur Wright, the older of the two brothers, he felt a bit restless. And by about 1895, he started looking around for a life challenge, something that would engage his intellect beyond the bicycle store. And he read in some magazine articles that there were people in other countries and in the United States that were beginning to experiment with building a flying machine, an airplane. They didn't have a word for it back then, so they called it a flying machine. And he read of a German experimenter named Otto Liebenthal and his attempts to build gliders. He had some successful attempts to build gliders where it was a human-powered, he would fly in the glider itself down the hill, almost like a hang glider. And sadly, this German fellow, he died in a glider accident. I think it was about 1898. But he inspired many to try and continue his work. And so Wilbur Wright read everything he could possibly read, and he developed some ideas about the process of how an airplane ought to be invented. His ideas were, you first have to have a very light vehicle, that you go in small steps, and that you make sure that that vehicle, that glider, can fly under human control. And that the last step would be to add an engine, a motor. Other people were taking a big motor and they were putting wings on it and trying to fly. And Wilbur Wright felt the way to go is to design the glider first and put on the motor as the very last step. And so he wrote a letter, a very famous letter, to the Smithsonian Institution. And the Smithsonian at that time was sort of like a big public library. It was a museum already. It was the place where people who were innovating would share information about what the projects they were up to. And in that famous letter that Wilbur Wright wrote to the Smithsonian, he said, "I am infected with the belief that flight is possible to man." That letter was answered by the Smithsonian, and one of the people that Wilbur Wright ended up being in touch with was an aviation pioneer from France, but living in Chicago, and his name was Octave Chanute. Wilbur Wright started a correspondence with Octave Chanute. Chanute was an elderly gentleman, and I think in his 70s, and he knew that he did not have the energy or the skill to design the flying machine that was so exciting part of that time. But he knew that he had all the skills to help those persons who did design that flying machine. He had all the background. And so he offered some encouragement to Wilbur Wright, and Wilbur found this encouragement very beneficial, because he felt that his approach, his process, was the one that was going to lead to success. Then Wilbur Wright, as he continued on his project to build a flying machine, he decided that he needed to find a location where the winds were steady, so that he could do multiple tests to measure the wings and to measure this and measure that. He needed steady wind. He wrote several letters to the United States Weather Service, and they responded that there were 3 places that sounded like they could serve his needs. One was in San Diego in California, another location was in Florida, and the third was in North Carolina on the Outer Banks. And in particular, there was a location named Kitty Hawk, a small fishing village. San Diego, California was attractive, except for the fact there wasn't any large sand dunes. And same for Florida. The size of the sand dunes or the quantity of sand dunes were not sufficient for Wilbur Wright, and so he decided to take his experiments to North Carolina. So after deciding that North Carolina was the location for his aeronautical tests, Wilbur Wright packed up the glider that he had designed, and he had not yet enlisted the support of his brother. They were very close, but this was Wilbur's project at that time. This was 1899 or so. Then about 1900, when he was out there in North Carolina, he built a shed and where he could live, and I think there was a second shed where the glider could live. And he spent a lot of time observing birds, especially the buzzards that would stay up in the air on these wind currents, and they would just float on the currents without even moving forward or backwards. And Wilbur Wright did lots of little tests with his glider going down the sand dunes. Now the glider was made of wood, and the wood that he chose was called spruce. Pine wood was more plentiful and less expensive, but spruce was the wood that had the durability that he needed. So the wings were made out of wood, and the plane or the glider was held together with wire and twine. It was very strong, like a thin rope covered in wax. The wings themselves were covered with a fabric, a sateen, S-A-T-E-E-N. It's like a linen. Imagine maybe like a bed sheet. And that the fabric was what lifted the plane or lifted the glider up, the air traveling over that fabric. So that fabric was an important part of the glider. They also sometimes called the glider a kite. And Wilbur Wright himself sewed the fabric tightly onto the frame, onto the wooden frame. Who taught him how to sew? His mother. His mother had taught him how to sew. She was a very practical-minded person, and he knew how to sew. And the sewing that he did was very strong sewing patterns. And he decided he needed the help of his younger brother Orville, and he invited him to come out and participate in the tests of the glider at Kitty Hawk. his brother was only too happy, came along and joined him as an equal partner in the project. And they considered themselves hobbyists. Their process of inventing the airplane was a scientific process, but they considered themselves amateurs, very skilled amateurs, but still hobbyists. As they were testing the glider, sometimes they would use bicycle chains right in the middle of the glider to simulate the weight of a human body. And they would send the glider down a hill with those bicycle chains. And they would observe how the glider was traveling. With each succeeding year, the glider became more and more refined and could be controlled. So one of the big realizations that Wilbur Wright made one day had to do with how the wings of the glider could be controlled by the operator of the glider. And that control mechanism was called wing warping. He came to the realization when he had a cardboard bicycle tube box in his store, and he twisted it. He twisted that box, and he noticed how the structure maintained its strength while it was twisted. And so he designed a way that the wings could be twisted, and as the wing was twisted, that means that the glider could turn left or turn right. One of the wings would go down and the other wing would kind of go up. Wilbur and Orville Wright took turns flying that glider down the dune, and they became so good at it, they could fly just 1 foot high off the ground and go all the way down the dune and control that glider. All the while, each year, they would travel back out to Kitty Hawk. They would be there in the fall because the fall was a slow time for their bicycle store. The bicycle store was very busy in the spring and summer, but come October or November, they just didn't have a lot of business. So that's when they left the store in the able hands of their partner, Charlie Taylor, who ran the store for them. And Charlie was very mechanically inclined and played a pivotal part in this whole story. Also, the younger sister, Kate, or Katie, was back home, and she helped supervise the running of the store. And there would be frequent correspondence, letters, between the Wright brothers and their younger sister. Then the time came for them to put a motor onto their glider. They were happy that they had designed a glider that could fly under human control, and so they went looking for a motor. They wrote letters and made inquiries to different companies that were designing and building internal combustion motors. The internal combustion motor had been invented in the early 1807 by a Swiss inventor, but it hadn't gained widespread use because there was not ready fuel available for it. And so they decided that they needed to have a motor that had at least 8 horsepower and that weighed less than 200 pounds. So when they were not able to buy such a motor from anybody, they asked Charlie Taylor, who was running the bicycle store, to build them a motor. And Charlie Taylor came through for them in a big way. The motor he built for them weighed under 200 pounds and had 12 horsepower. The glider itself was pretty light. It weighed just barely over 100 pounds, if you can imagine it. It was a very light but very strong structure. It was also partly flexible so that if the glider ever did crash, there would be some give. If the glider hit the sand, as long as it was not traveling too fast, there would be some give or some play. And they did have some small crashes as they were doing their gliding experiments. The big day came on December 17th, 1903. The wind was blowing about 25 miles an hour. which is quite substantial for flying an airplane of the kind that the Wright brothers had designed. There were some risks in flying on that day. They would have done better waiting for a slighter wind, but they decided that they wanted to fly on that day, and they flipped a coin. Orville won, and he flew for a number of seconds under the power of their engine, and it was a controlled flight. He didn't go particularly far. Wilbur's turn was next, and he flew 59 seconds under the power of a motor on the hills of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. They sent a telegram home to their dad and told their dad to alert the press. Sadly, their mother had passed away and was not able to witness or hear about their flights. Their father alerted the press, but the press was very skeptical. The press had heard lots of other reports of people who claimed that they had invented a flying machine. And even in their hometown of Dayton, Ohio, one of the reporters said, 59 seconds, that's not a news story. If they had flown for 59 minutes, that would have been a news story, but 59 seconds, that's not a news story. And Orville and Wilbur Wright took that comment to heart, and their next goal was to take their plane up into the air for 59 minutes. And that goal took a couple of years. They moved their experiments back to Dayton after their successes of 1903. And they found that in Dayton the wind was not as steady. And without a steady wind, they needed something to help launch the airplane up into the air. And so they built a catapult where there would be a weight that fell down. They built a tower, and there was a weight that would fall. As that weight was fall, it would throw the plane forward. It would pull the plane down a track and throw it up into the air. So using their catapult system, they continued their experiments there in Dayton, Ohio, in a field that was maybe 5 or 10 miles away. That field was right near a railroad track, and the Wright brothers were scared that too many people were able to see them flying. They wanted to keep their invention more secret until they had the kind of success that they could take their invention and start selling it. So they didn't have any public demonstrations of their airplane for several years after 1903. Several years after they flew, they did not have any public demonstrations. They did invite some reporters to come visit, but on the day that they invited those reporters, they had mechanical problems with their motor, with their engine, and so they didn't fly. And the reporters walked away saying, "These people don't have a flying machine." The big turnaround came in 1908, 5 years after their first flight. Wilbur Wright traveled to France and was ready to give a public demonstration of his flying machine. And he had developed skill as a pilot in taking off, landing, making big circles. People who saw the Wright brothers' plane, they were astounded at how lightly the plane would touch down on the ground. Wilbur Wright would cut the engine, and then he would pull the nose of the plane a little bit up, and the plane would land with hardly any force on the ground. And it was just a sight to see. It was just a sight to see. So in August 2008, Wilbur Wright gave his first public demonstrations of the plane in France, and the crowd went wild. They had heard about this, and the crowd went wild. So it was on that date in August 1908 that the world fully came to understand what the Wright brothers had invented back in 1903. Barely a month later, Orville Wright, who had stayed in the United States, gave a demonstration of their flying machine to the United States Army and at Fort Myer in Arlington, Virginia. And that demonstration included the first airplane fatality, where Orville Wright took up a passenger with him, and the plane had some kind of problem and it dove down towards the ground. Orville Wright ended up breaking his leg, and he broke 2 ribs, and he was in the hospital, or he was recovering for quite a number of months. And his passenger was killed in that airplane accident. But nevertheless, he did encounter some success in showing the capabilities of their flying machine to the United States Army. In 1909, 1 year after Wilbur Wright flew in France, he took their flying machine to New York City. And with 1 million spectators, Wilbur Wright flew his flying machine up over the Hudson River around the Statue of Liberty. And within those 1 million people were a number of reporters who could do nothing but say that this was an invention that would change history, and that the Wright brothers had designed a flying machine that was fully under the control of the operator of the machine. And that 1909 flying exhibition in New York meant that the Wright brothers did not have to spend more effort trying to convince people of the value of their invention. 2 years after that, 2 or 3 years after that, Wilbur Wright died of typhoid. He contracted typhoid, an illness, and he died. Orville Wright lived all the way to 1948, right through World War II. In fact, he lived through the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that must have been probably a difficult day for him when he heard that a whole city had been destroyed by the use of an airplane. Orville Wright, he sold his share in the company. They had the Wright, they formed a company for building and selling airplanes, and Orville Wright got out of that. He didn't want to be a businessman. All he wanted to do is tinker around and build more and better airplanes. By the 1910 or so, the airplanes that the Wright brothers were building were no longer small little glider types. They were weighing as much as 1,000 pounds, and they had a more substantial engine, and they also had a seat. The earliest Wright brother airplanes, the pilot flew lying down to minimize wind resistance, wind drag. But as the motors became larger that they put onto their airplane, they were able to sit in the airplane and even have a passenger. So that's the story of the Wright brothers. The interesting part of it is the process, how they went about designing the airplane. People said that when they overheard them talking, Orville and Wilbur Wright, it almost sounded like they were arguing, that their voices were louder and louder. But this is what they also heard. They also heard Orville or Wilbur saying things like, "I think you're right." So they would talk loudly, not in anger, but with passion about the design choices that they needed to make. And through their dialogue back and forth, they were able to make some excellent decisions in the many, many small steps that were needed to build the first airplane. And there's even the story that when they were at Kitty Hawk, Wilbur Wright used to go to sleep early. He'd go to sleep at like 7 o'clock after a full day's work. Orville Wright used to stay up a couple more hours, and he would do thinking. He would think about the day's experiments. And the next day, he would talk to his brother and he would say, "You know, I've been thinking about this." And Wilbur Wright would listen to his brother's ideas, and together it was almost like one human being with 2 brains. One human being with 2 brains is maybe the best way of describing the Wright brothers as they were working together. They had different ways of seeing things, and they had a great ability to listen to one another. And it was that ability that allowed them to surpass all other people doing experiments with flying machines, and they won the race. It was a race to design the first flying machine. They won that race. And here's the great irony. Here's the great irony. After they were acknowledged as the true inventors of the airplane, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. Did not fully believe that they were the people who had invented the airplane. There was other contenders. And so the Wright brothers took their first flying machine from 1903, and they sent it to the Science Museum of London in England, where it lived until Orville Wright died. Until 1948, their first flying machine was not to be seen at any museum in the United States. Only after Orville Wright died was that machine repatriated, did it come back to the United States, where it lives at the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. So that was kind of a sad part of their story. Even with all the successes that they encountered, they were still not able to convince some people that they were the true inventors of the airplane. And it took almost 50 years for that acknowledgement to happen.